Well, my name is Wayne Fox. I'm the new superintendent there in White Shield High School or White Shield School. Also alumni of the school, so it's very different, coming back being a superintendent and also being a former student there, walking down the halls and kind of reminiscing as you go along. I grew up actually partly in White Shield, North Dakota, but in my younger elementary, middle school years, I grew up in Denver, Colorado, Westminster, Colorado. At that time, we were still brought into a lot of our cultural ways of going to powwows, traveling up north to visit my grandpa and my grandma, going to the war bonnet dances, and being, I guess, educated in that way of knowing how to give away, knowing when to dance, knowing about military wars, in a different way, and how to honor different people. And I always think that's a education in itself, as you go along. And as we were growing up there in Denver, we had long hair, I had long hair, going to powwows, and it was quite different back then, People would ask you why you had the long hair, and you would always just kind of go back and say, well, you wouldn't say, you're Native American, because they knew you were Native American. Well, I dance, and it's just our culture of who we are. And, we never really thought anything different, and we maybe saw a lot of prejudice at that time, but we didn't see it. We looked upon it. We went forward. My dad was always very strict in education. He'd always say this is the only way to remove yourself from a situation. Was education. So he always talked about it. And so my family, all my brothers and sisters are educated. Work, very hard workers, raise families. And as we were growing up, my dad also worked for the government. So then he said, well, he wanted to move back home, which was in North Dakota. And so, kind of partly growing up in the city, but always going back to, different areas of powwowing. We'd travel all over the United States, going to Arizona, going to New Mexico, going to, all over. We moved back to North Dakota, and it was a cultural shock for us, for a lot, for my siblings also, and asking, God, why does everybody wear the same clothes here? Everybody wears the same clothes, and here's this, me, I think I wore 501 Levi's with Van shoes, they're still around today, regular t-shirt, and everybody here is wearing cowboy boots and Wranglers and button shirts, and I was like, why are these young guys wearing like button shirts, and that's just that thought, and we'd wear polos, and and some of it would still be kind of not buttoned up, but it was just one of that time, it was that moment. But once again, being there with our grandparents as well, and growing up with them, and my grandpa always, telling stories, just like he always said, you never know when you were going to go see her, see what you were going to do whenever you went there, and I'd always go over there because my mom, or not my grandma, she would always cook, so that was the best place to go, even to this day, I always talk about food. My wife goes, oh, here he goes again, talking about food. Even my little daughter, like, she'll roll her eyes, but I guess that's a place to my heart is food, and so my grandma was always there, and then I would always listen to my grandpa tell these stories, and when he had visitors, or maybe he had elders over, like missionary, the LDS people, they would come over and they'd share about, the LDS ways, our Catholic ways, and he would kind of talk about a little bit different, but then as a person sitting at the table, you would see some of those similarities, because we were always into that, the culture, of hearing, of songs, and going to powwows, and also going to traditional powwow, very, like traditional powwows where they would kill a cow right in front of you and butcher it and gut it and then cut it up and throw it into a soup, and then you'd have it a little while later, and also going to my dad also introduced me to sweat lodges when I was very young, and continued at that stage, and so it kind of was embedded in me to have that along the way while I was growing up, and but in that setting with my grandpa and grandma, he would always talk about, he would always I would think that this man would probably know about 5 or 6 languages, Cree, French, Lakota, Chippewa, Rikra, Hidatsa, and he'd laugh at me and say, "I'll bet you didn't know I could talk like, all this," and I'd laugh and laugh, and he'd tell me, but he'd always tell me jokes. And as I kind of grew up and then start, learning a little bit more things, those stories began to be like life lessons that he was talking about, and at that time they were very funny, but they always had that sense of, where you kind of had to get that point where you maybe 5 years later you got the point like, oh yeah, and that's, and it not only did it take, maybe most of the day, maybe it took maybe 5 years before you caught that story, and as you followed into that. As I graduated, we once again, my father always pursued school, and we went to school. We went to, I went to Mayville. Didn't do too good my first year, as everybody, some of us, and we just kind of, continued on with the journey. My dad would always say, "Well, what you gonna do? Where do you see yourself in 2 years?" And he'd always sit in his chair. When I'd come home and visit, I was like, "Oh my God, he's sitting in that chair again. What's he gonna say to me?" And then my siblings, we'd always talk about, was he sitting in his chair again? Yeah, he was sitting in his chair again. And he'd always be taught, and so as we went along, as we, did our journey, our educational journey, we start hitting little pieces of our education, start completing here and start completing over here. And my sister Stacy, she completed it, first, and the struggle for her, watching her, and then after a little while, then I completed the struggle of getting the education, because I call it a struggle because you're in that almost poverty-stricken stage where you can remember ramen noodles, you can remember macaroni cheese, or you can remember getting down to the last bits and pieces of your food, and then also trying to work and trying to go to school at the same time, and at that time when I finished my bachelor's, my words I always kind of hear was, my dad said, and this was getting kind of close, and he said, because he probably was kind of waiting for me to finish, because I was probably the hard one, the one that was, "Oh God, Wayne, I don't know about you, And after I graduated, he said, now I can die, and I thought, and I kind of looked at him, and I thought he was kind of joking, but he actually, maybe he, had some sense of he'll be okay now, And I was kind of, it was kind of different, it was kind of different, and I kind of sitting back and thinking, going back into the stage right now and thinking about it, you still kind of get kind of jerked about it, and so I continued on. We continued on with the journey, and I completed my, like I said, my bachelor's, and start teaching. And met some wonderful teachers along the way, wonderful people, wonderful kids, and finding out that passion of wanting to be that teacher, not just coming there, but being that, having that passion, having that drive to get that, just having that drive, and I guess on the other part, I'm not saying that we lived in poverty, but when you start getting out of college and when you get that first check over, like, wow, $700, you're a first year teacher, you're like, whoa, I can do a lot of things, and then you take your kids to Bismarck and you kind of do a little bit of things and stuff like that, just that thinking, you're like, wow, was I crazy, and but having that cultural piece is very important, that understanding of where our children come from, and I always say it's not just Indian children, it's all Indian, it's all children that have that sense of, because sometimes we never know what those children are going through. And so having that understanding and that compassion, I believe is the main key of being a great teacher. And I'm not saying that I'm a great teacher, but I have those instilled in me, and as I went along, I met my wife, Jennifer, and through a couple failed marriages, I met my wife, Jennifer, and we were both going through some tough things. That meantime, I lost my dad, and things just kind of, the grieving process was just kind of missed. It was there, but as I think as Indian people, sometimes we don't know how to grieve. We don't know how to talk because of, I don't want to hurt your feelings if I say this, or I don't want to say, so we kind of hold a lot of things in with us. So then I think that grieving process kind of stays with us for a while, and in the meantime, I got back into teaching, and I met my wife, and meantime, a lot of it, I think it took me a couple years to kind of get, kind of bring myself back. My wife was very patient with me, and watched me teach fifth grade. And then we went to Heart of the Earth, where most of our kids were, I would have to say 60% homeless, being shuffled in by a taxi cab in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, in the inner cities, in an all Indian school. And being able to connect with these students. And then we moved to South Dakota, my wife and I, and in the meantime we still had our family. She had her 3 boys and we had our baby, and at that time I was in the process of seeing my kids as well, and once again that grieving process was still there, and I just seemed like, and as we went along, I went to Kyle, South Dakota. And I think that area, that place was probably, in fact, I just came back from there, and I always say, that was probably one of the greatest feelings that I've ever had of teaching there. And those kids that I was able to teach are still around me today, whether it's culturally or whether it's just by, passing by. I always say those kids brought me back to that area, because they realized of how important that understanding was. Not only did you have to understand as a teacher of where they came from, of how they wanted to be, but yet they understood me for some odd reason of where I was at, and so they, it was kind of a process where I would help them and they helped me a lot. And so from there, then after that, I went and got into my master's program, and I thought, well, let me, I want to be a principal. I thought, let's just, but in the meantime, I did kind of want to see how other Indian schools operated. I just didn't want to go from a bachelor's to a master's, but I wanted to understand things. I wanted to see how things operated, and most of the part, I also wanted to understand where teachers were coming from, of how they thought and how they, and once again, my wife was always, my stone, and she would always, be able to tell me a different perspective, maybe a female perspective where it was more, had compassion, and then she's very stern as well, and so it was okay. And as soon as we finished there, I think we were in Kyle for a couple years, maybe 3 years, and it was probably, like I said, it was probably one of the best years of my life there, and we were, brought in with the culture. We had a lot of culture, spirituality, and I think that's what I was missing, was the spirituality piece, because these children had it. No matter how, you could say, poverty they were, in that mode, they were very spiritual. They would sing a prayer song in the morning, and that was just my class. And we had a drum in our, and all of a sudden all this stuff coming back in my room, and these kids every morning would say, "Mr. Fox, I want to sing a prayer song before we leave," or and that connect was like, and it was just, it wasn't really like, but it was one of those moments like, wow, here I got these kids, but these kids also believe in me. Of thinking, because I always say, this is the only way to remove yourself from this situation. Of my dad was education, and then to understand that sometimes, yes, education is important, but it's not that important. It was that it took down there they call them unchis, a grandma, for her to come in and say, I just want you to teach my grandchild, because he wants to stay here and work or take care of me. And this one lesson that I was doing, I did a lesson that I wanted to ask them, like my dad would always say, well, where do you see yourself in 2 years? Where do you see yourself in 3 years? A couple of my students said, just living in Kyle, watching over my grandma and grandpa, and that kind of gave me some more understanding, a little bit of understanding, and back then, 2000, when Bush was president, that No Child Left Behind was very strong. That's actually what I wrote my thesis on, was the NCLB, and I knew that, these kids were very resilient. These Indian children that were very resilient, because they were able to walk into my classroom and know that culture was there. Whether it was a prayer song or whether it was just bits and pieces of stories of where you saw that moment of, whether it's in science or social studies or math or even any writing, where you would see that moment as a teacher, and you would say, and you would just shift off from your lesson plan, and you would say, okay, now a long time ago this is how they did this, or this is how this was structured, and these kids were like, they would look, and so then you would kind of slowly lead into, then you would actually catch yourself kind of going off a little bit too, and like really getting into it and stuff, and then so you would have to say, okay, I got to go back to my plan here. So then you'd go back, but in the meantime, these kids, and it was that once again, that understanding. And as we went along, I graduated with my master's, and I wanted to, I was blessed with opportunities, you can say, and I, of being able to find programs that actually paid for your master's, and different ways. Because I'm still paying for my undergrad, believe it or not, so I had to become principal, to pay back, and so we moved to Cannibal, and North Dakota, which was another good place. I have nothing, when sometimes administrators leave a place, they always have stuff, but I have nothing but, respect for those people, the people that lived in that community, and the struggles that they were faced with, but those kids knew the same thing, and they understood where I was coming from, and I understood where they were coming from, and I had that compassion still, and I never wanted to lose that compassion, because it was, it was very important. But yet I was still test driven because of the NCLB, and as an administrator, that's how you rate it, and it was very hard, but I also wanted that cultural component of our students, and it didn't matter if I was Hidatsa or Rikra, but these were Dakota people, so I had to enrich myself in this culture here, and say, this is no matter who I am, this is who we are, because there was still a lot of similarities, still a lot of relationships and a lot of stories that go along between these people, the Dakotas and the Arikaras, and then even further the Lakotas. And then my dad or my grandpa would always tell me stories about gentlemen in Cannibal, about grass dancers, and they, so when I went into this community, I knew certain bits and pieces of family, of what my grandpa would always kind of talk about. And we were, I think teaching staff was excellent. We were very successful, I'm going to say, with that school. And and I still talk to the administrator from Cannibal, and he was it was we brought in once again, prayer songs. We brought in the language, and it was there. And I had always talked about these children before the children could achieve. They need to know who they are. The identity. They may not know the language, but if they can know bits and pieces, and I used to always just the rock in the water. You throw it in there, and it'll just the ripple effect, and the kids really shined, and I always made sure that I was able to learn some of the language. And when we came on for the morning announcements, I would always say that, and the community also heard me, and whatever I said, the community would hear, and some, always come back to me and say, "Hi, I still miss how you used to say that," and everything. But as years went on, I was put into this, once again, the opportunity came up, and I was in there for my education specialist degree. And as I was in Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana, and it was I-LEAD, where they were picking out Indian leaders to become, doc, with EDD, doc, with education and looking at different areas. And so I thought, well, here's an opportunity, let me take it, and so as I went along, I was talked into working on my doctorates, and I was like, what was I thinking, and I passed, I did my comps, did my oral comps, and I was just so, a 3-hour process. But one thing that I always reminded myself of was the culture, or was my identity. And that was the piece, I think, that I was able to use, and I always think prior to that, I was a hoop dancer. I was a dancer. In my younger years, I was a hoop dancer where I connected those hoops into behavior, model, where everybody was connected, where everybody had that unity, whether we were white, black, yellow, red, we had that connection. No matter who we prayed to, no matter what we did, we always came back to who we are, and that was as a whole. And so I always, and that took me all over the place. It took me to Costa Rica, it took me to Japan, it took me, and just being able to do this and share this. And once again, I was able to open my mind by, this here, this. I never thought this would take me all over and pay for my somewhat of my education, help support my children and whatnot. And as I completed, that portion, I left to the higher ed area, and and it just too much paperwork. I was thinking I just wasn't, and I was struggling. I was really struggling, and I was thinking, God, I can't change the world here. I need, and so and at that time, all my boys graduated. We had 6 boys in the house, and I had 1 girl and our baby. And they were all teenage boys, 17, some were 6'5", some were down, I think the smallest one was like 5'11", and all athletic. And we, we were going all over the place, you know, whether it's cross country, basketball, football, whatever it was, we were going, you know, and here as we went, you know, we took a year break, and we thought, you know, let's just take a year break. We never took a year, you know, you know, we just kind of, you know, our son plays for football for UND Division One, and we thought, well, let's follow him. So we bought an RV. We're going to go all over, and then said, in the meantime, well, we can sub here. We can sub in Garrison. We go, you know, we had this little dream of, you know, whatever, you know, and stuff, and because we only had one kid at the house, so, you know, and so we started doing that, and we ended up in White Shell, North Dakota. You know, moved back home, and it was, you know, not once did I ever think I was going to go move home, you know, and live right there. And my wife came back. She said, you know, I don't even think they're looking for teachers, Wayne. And I said, yeah. But in the meantime, I was getting attached to these sixth graders where I was the long-term sub, and I knew a lot of these students that were struggling, but they were coming to school, but they weren't saying anything. They weren't talking about it. They weren't, you know, they were just, and once again, that resiliency of our Indian students, you know, and wanting to please me, you know, and they were saying, you know, Mr. Fox, you know, I've never gotten a, you know, bad grade in my life, but until I got into your grade, yeah, I'm getting like C's and D's. I said, well, you know, this is what I demand. This is what I want from you, and having that understanding. But the most important, once again, having that cultural connect with them and being able to kind of go back and use that cultural piece, you know, and it wasn't never unplanned, you know, and that's one thing I'm never always gonna say. It was never planned, you know. You would have your lesson plans, and you would have, this is what I'm teach this year, but then it was never planned where you were gonna come across water and then you were gonna talk about water, or you were gonna talk about a circle, you were gonna talk about blood quantum as fractions, you know, and make students aware of, you know, well, you know, Mr. Fox, I'm a fourth Rikra, I'm a fourth Hidatsa, and I'm half Sioux, and you know, and then using that piece as your introduction to fractions, you know, you know, it was just like that there, you know, or that piece there, or looking at the structure of the Earth Lodge, or looking at the structure of a camp, you know, of how it was set up, you know, and different things, you know, you would kind of hit pieces. And so we went in White, you know, we were there in White Shield, and you know, we were there, and once again, you know, I said, you know, I taught on every other reservation. I never was able to teach my own, you know, and I enjoyed it. I really did, you know, going home, and you know, you weren't in that administrative position anymore. You were just able to go home and, you know, but, you know, the greatest part about it is you only had 8 students. And so it was very, you know, very easy to, you know, make sure you had great papers. You almost sat in a Sylvan type style where you were able to, like, boom, 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 and you're, you know, and you're just able to do different things with these students. And as we went along, the superintendent position opened up in White Shield, and nobody was really applying for it, and different things were kind of happening to the school, and I thought, well, back in my mind, I thought, well, maybe this is why I'm here. This is why I'm here, and, you know, and maybe it is, maybe it's not, you know. And so that's where I'm at today.